what has made us all, myself included, be drawn to the electric universe theories, the Thunderbolts Project, to Dave, to Wall, I know that for a lot of you, that has been the presentation of a question or a problem, and then just being absolutely marveled at some of the possibilities, at the answers that they come up with. What we're going to be doing here is going over, sort of from a macro scale, some of these important things that we have all learned and heard about, and hopefully that we're going to continue to hear about for years. And I really hope that some of these questions are not only informational, but sort of help us set the tone going forward. So, the first topic, so to speak, is, did the present solar system emerge from planetary chaos?
Well, that is a good question, and it is a question on which my own life's work has offered a radical perspective, because I'm sure everyone that is here today understands that there's a mainstream scientific paradigm with respect to the planetary system. And that mainstream paradigm is that the planets have moved on their present courses for 1 billion years and more. And here is a perspective that challenges the entire underpinnings of the uneventful solar system of modern theory. There is a reason why our early ancestors remembered the planets as the great gods, and they remembered the wars of the gods, and they remembered specific identities of specific planets globally. Most of you have heard women are from Venus and men are from Mars. Now, is that something that someone in the 20th century, Dr. Gray, just made up? Or was he just picking up on a rather obvious ancient cultural theme that remains unexplained? Why did early cultures consistently attribute a female personality to Venus? Why did they consistently attribute a masculine personality to Mars? The answer to that question has to come from outside the common persuasions today, and it is a fact that no one has offered a persuasive or even satisfactory explanation for the masculine Mars and the feminine Venus. So that's the kind of question that in the early phases of my own research, it was just shouting that something is missing. But as I continued the research, it became clear that this story is vast. Humanity as a whole experienced a completely different sky. The sky has changed. The order of the planets has changed. The character of the planets in world mythology has to have an explanation. There is a reason for the feminine Venus and the masculine Mars, and it runs farther than just that particular mystery. Because very early in my research, I was puzzled by something that tended to stand out in the earliest cultures of Mesopotamia. There was this insistence that the ancient sun god was Saturn. And that was such a fundamental persuasion of the earliest cultures. You still would see this down into Greek times and Latin times. The Greek Chronos, the planet Saturn, was also named, explicitly named in the earliest text, Helios, the sun. Same with the Latin Saturn as the god Sol. So Sol, the ancient Latin sun god, was again explicitly identified as Saturn. So this raised for me a question that seemed essential to ask if one is to get to the bottom of the enigmas, the unexplained patterns. And I was quite amazed to discover that the basic patterns of the early cultures are global. These are archetypes, actually. An ancient sun god is an archetype. You'd have a hard time finding a major culture that didn't remember a primeval sun. That's a sun god ruling before the present sun. So how likely is it that you would get global patterns finding no explanation in experience today that have no explanation? There must be a provocation for an enigmatic global pattern. And that was the purpose then. When I launched my research, man alive, this goes all the way back to before my familiarity with Immanuel Velikovsky. So in 1971, I was challenged personally by this question that just had no resolution, but I was provoked by Velikovsky. And as I became more familiar with Velikovsky's work, what became most clear is that there are explanations for global patterns. There have to be. And that was the beginning of my research. So again, 1972, and I was able to put together in a couple of years enough of a case for a different solar system in ancient times, and specifically the preeminent position of the planet Saturn in the ancient cultures, Saturn as the ancient sun god. And I put together an article called Saturn, the Polar Night Sun, and I sent it to Doubleday, talked with the senior editor, Walter Bradbury, and about 10 days later, I had received a commitment from Doubleday for what Walter Bradbury said was the biggest advance they'd ever given to a previously unpublished and unknown author. And that was the genesis then of my book, The Saturn Myth. And I envisioned that that would be a fairly straight path to write that book and establish a case for Saturn as the ancient sun god, a dominant power in the sky. And I don't think on any issue as to personal life and future work, I don't think I've ever been more wrong than that, because this was like a cascade of discoveries. After I got the contract with Doubleday, I had to finish the book, The Saturn Myth, and I just had not even imagined on the front end of the research that this is just a huge field. I mean, everything begins to change. The entire perception of the ancient world begins to change. And then there was this tumultuous phase of research after I finished the Saturn Myth, in which Mars and Venus came in even more powerfully than Saturn. In the early cultures, there's a flowering of Mars and Venus symbolism that it almost overwhelms the earlier memories of the primeval sun, the god Saturn, and so on. So why was Venus intrinsically feminine, and why was Mars intrinsically masculine? Well, the masculine character of Mars, it became so clear, was tied into another archetype, which is the archetype of the world mountain. Mars influenced humanity around the world, and in a critical turn of Martian history, that planet became the apex of what is classically called the world mountain. All of the interdisciplinary researchers have recognized that there's a myth of a world mountain. It makes no sense. It's not referring to anything seen. It is associated with the axis of the world, but it's described as a stream of luminous material rising along the world axis. That's the global myth of the world mountain. And then one mythic concept begins to bleed into others. It wasn't just a great column, the world mountain, world pillar. It was also the underworld river. It was also a stream of wind or etheric glowing air joining the Earth to another planet, and that planet represents the apex of the world mountain as the planet Mars. And that was then again just the beginning of more disclosures, more revelations about the nature of the ancient sky. And it didn't quit. So today I'm just as much engrossed by the research as I was 40 years ago.
Before I ask you, turn my microphone off. Before I ask you about sun-diving comets, I want to quickly ask you, because I'm sure you know, because you're following it and because I send these things to you guys sometimes when I find them. With all of the research that's coming out, I'm sure you've heard about the NICE model where it's talking about some of the planets switch places. The research that's coming out, and it is now mainstream science that Mercury survived an inner system pileup. That planets almost hit the Earth. I'm curious. I don't know whether to ask you which among those things is the most exciting to you, or if you are discouraged by the fact that we have basically a confirmation of the exact same story that our ancestors were telling, except the astronomers who are telling the story today say it happened tens of hundreds of millions of years ago.
There are different threads to any answer to that question, because first there is the validity of this idea that there was a pileup in the inner solar system. And quite frankly, if you had to base a revolutionary theory on the history of the solar system, on the kind of trivial evidence they've cited so far on behalf of that idea, I mean, you wouldn't get it anywhere with the kind of detail and so on that I've personally been working with for decades. Was there a planetary pileup? I imagine that they are looking at evidence of planetary interactions that you wouldn't get at the present distances. So they're looking at surface features, and these surface features don't easily fall into place when you're thinking of such isolated bodies evolving over in that isolation over 1 billion years and more. Well, this is so far from the concept that I've worked with and the layers of evidence that I've been assembling for 4 decades, and there has to be a reason for the layers of evidence. In other words, you're working with common themes in the ancient world, like the primeval sun, like the polar sun, because there's an association of that body with the world axis and the summit of the pole at the pole. But that is just the beginning. The evidence is directing your attention back to a gathering of planets. So they see evidence that planets were interacting. You wouldn't get the kind of dynamic surface configurations that you see on planets evolving in isolation. So how do we then work with the actual evidence that is available from the early cultures? They're the ones to look to. They're the ones who experienced a radically different sky, and the result of that experience was all of world mythology. Today, I wouldn't have said this with such confidence in the first year or two, but every recurrent theme of world mythology is explicable in terms of a particular model supported entirely by the global patterns of ancient myth and symbol.
Yeah, you can definitely notice and mark a time when the imagination of humans was really born. It really was more of perhaps academic's not the right word, because they didn't have books and they weren't studying, but it was not as fanciful. It was not as though they had the imagination before that. That's interesting. So
yeah.
Moving on to sun-diving comets. Really basic. How does EU explain how these tiny, tiny little things can affect something so big as the sun? Which we do see, it's observable. We can see it time and time again, but it begs some kind of mechanistic explanation.
That takes me back to the first images I recall from the SOHO satellite and other sun imaging systems, and a tiny little speck of a comet or an asteroid either plunges right into the sun or it grazes the upper atmosphere of the sun, and then all of a sudden the sun appears to respond with the coronal mass ejection. But now, okay, What's the diameter of the sun? 860 million. Big. So imagine a 1 mile rock hitting a huge sphere of the sun, hundreds of thousands of miles in diameter. Why would the sun respond that way? And often respond, in fact, perhaps in the majority of cases, respond before it had actually struck the sun. So there's an electrical implication in all of this, and that implication fits very well with the electric universe perception of solar system history, solar system dynamics, and specifically the electrical attributes of the sun. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with Wal Thornhill's work on the sun, but he convinced me in 1994. He flew to Portland from Australia, lived in my office for, I don't know, about 6 weeks, and he came to convince me that the history of the solar system that I was speculating on is spectacularly explained by electric fields, the electric sun. So that actually led to a partnership between Wal Thornhill and myself on the electric universe, a convergence of myth and science. And I would say this is the first instance that I can think of in which myth and science coming together actually does appear fully plausible to me. And it was fully plausible to Wal Thornhill as well. So Wal and I became colleagues in a lifelong adventure. And I love the phrase, the electric universe. I love being a part of that.
Could you tell us or describe a little bit about the curse of the uniformity principle in the sciences?
I've been kind of alluding to it, but not being explicit. I think that the condition of the space sciences today is hopelessly confined within a paradigm that has no support. It was based on a guess, the uneventful solar system, a universe devoid of electric currents was just an inherent part of that scientific edifice. So, can you read that question again? Because I don't want to go off on my own tangent.
Well, what I have here is, we have this potential curse of the uniformity principle, and often the most difficult challenge is to see the signs of a breakdown in scientific reasoning when the new evidence requires the shake-up in thinking.
Yeah, I don't think there's a more pervasive resistance to the kind of themes that we work with than is put up by people who are convinced that the uniformity principle defines the familiar solar system. There is no consideration whatsoever given to ancient cultural memories of planetary catastrophe. Why were the planets remembered as gods? This is a worldwide phenomenon. Why were there memories around the world of catastrophic wars of the gods? What was this horrific thunderbolt of the gods that looks nothing like lightning, but it looks exactly like electric discharge in plasma? These things are not to just be dismissed simply because we have a model that we were taught in school that nothing of terrible consequence happened in the history of the solar system, and the planets have always moved on these orbits for millions and even billions of years.
All right, Dave. This is a question that I think some people have had in their minds for a long time, and this is the hard one. So this one has a little bit of a setup, and I think it's important that everyone take in the setup as much as they take in the eventual answer. And this first part should resonate and feel true to many of you. So the Thunderbolts project and this group has inspired literally thousands of new voices for an electric universe, not to mention the people that are doing the experiments and other things like that. And it remains, the Thunderbolts do, despite this vast spread, the most known, most watched, and certainly most influential in the observer's world in terms of the progression of the electric universe. For me, earthquake forecasting wouldn't be possible. Most of the stuff about the magnetic reversal, the star water principles, everything involving space weather and solar terrestrial physics.
Yeah, that's right.
Implied in the magnitude of a life's work is a difficult reality that it has taken a long time, years, decades, and that makes one realize that someday it'll be somebody like me or Eugene or Michael Claridge who trying to fill your shoes in the best way we can.
Are you talking about?
I wasn't going to say it. No, but in all seriousness, I'm certain that there are things in your mind that you must really want us not to forget. Maybe certain things you would want us to pursue. Message you want to leave behind for.
Oh, sure. It's electric, stupid. Well, I'll tell you what, I've actually been paying much more attention in the last 2 to 4 years to younger people that are coming in and showing signs of being able to assume leadership. An electric universe movement is not going to be contained or directed by a single individual. It's just not. But we enjoy every opportunity to collaborate and align ourselves with people who are doing independent research. And you'll see more and more of this in the coming years. I don't doubt this. There's an ability of the electric universe to inspire individuals and organizations. And I have to say, of all of the organizations we have ever connected with, there's none that has been more impressive in showing the ability to grow organizationally than Ben's group. So, congratulations.
Can you just picture it, the way you and the people you've worked with probably sat around and talked about Velikovsky, and even when you were describing to me the times when you had to back away from a Velikovskyan pure paradigm, and you had to start saying, wait a minute, there are some things we have to rethink. I envision so many of those conversations coming through, and people referencing, oh, well, do you remember when Dave said this, or do you remember Wall's book when he said this? I really think that it's important that a lot of folks out here listening, and who will eventually be listening to this live interview over the internet, to take something he said very, very seriously, and that is that no one person can drive this. It's nice that he called this Ben's organization, but everything that's happening this weekend was my wife. The number of emails, the number of tips, comments that have come in over the past 6 years from now 300,000 people, it is a team. It is a movement. But at the same time, right now, in the electric universe realm of it, we do have a leader. And I hope you're not ready to stop being the leader just yet, because I still feel like there's a lot of direction that needs to come. And
well, I have no plans in that direction in the short term.
But you also bring a calmer wisdom to it, because there are researchers who could spend their entire lives never doing what you did with Velikovsky, because you essentially said I was wrong. And do you have any idea how rare something like that is? Because you said, all right, well, because you really were all about Velikovsky at one point, and then,
Yeah.
I mean, but Velikovsky wasn't so much about Saturn as he was about Venus, right?
That's correct. His Saturn material hadn't been published at that time, and because I had read Worlds in Collision 2 or 3 times, I was particularly interested, well, what was this about? And there's a story there, actually, as to how I became familiar with Velikovsky's Saturn thesis, and it really, really intrigued me, because this was not territory that most people were familiar with, and I was publishing Immanuel Velikovsky Reconsidered. It was having a huge impact globally, actually. We had 75,000 subscribers at one time. And so I was encouraged to believe that there might be a unique contribution that I could make by starting with what Velikovsky had said about Saturn. He was claiming that Saturn, in an earlier time before the so-called Venus and Mars catastrophes, going down into the first millennium BC, maybe 3,000 years BC, Saturn was a spectacular body in the sky. And it was the subject of veneration around the world, and there was, as Velikovsky put it, an apparent, confusion between the sun in antiquity and the planet Saturn. Now, when you're trying to get to the bottom of a global pattern, the first thing you look for would be the things that don't add up. There is nothing known to modern science that would give you the slightest indication that somebody would conjure the most remote planet as having been the preeminent power in the sky and called Helios or called Sol in earlier times. So that was a mystery I felt was accessible. You only had to look. And then I began to find these German and French scholars who were puzzling over this in the 19th century, Ben. So this was not a short-term mystery. This was a mystery that scholars puzzled over, and nobody ever gave a plausible reason as to why Saturn would, in the early languages, have been identified as the ancient sun god. And that's how the research progressed. Then I saw increasingly it's not just that this is an ancient sun god. The ancient sun god occupied the cosmic center. The cosmic center was explicitly identified as the celestial pole. And then other symbols come into play, like he rules at the summit of the world mountain. Well, what was the world mountain? It just was opening up one field of investigation after another, and the critical turn, quite frankly, that convinced me this isn't a field of interesting make-believe, was when I began to look at the symbolism of the crescent. That crescent was placed on that primeval sun. You can just go back into the early cultures and you'll see a star in a crescent. That crescent is on a huge sphere that is called the primeval sun, and nobody has ever explained why, as was recognized in the 19th century. That crescent was identified as Saturn. There was something there that was drawing me in to the patterns of ancient thought and the discovery that not a single pattern that can be named, and there are hundreds of them that can be named, not a single one answers to our sky that we know today. Now that's not a small matter, because pattern recognition, I mean, every good detective is going to look for patterns, and he's going to look specifically for patterns that don't fit just the normal experience, something out of the ordinary. So I made a lifelong study of identifying the ancient patterns, noting that they did not fit with anything observed in our sky today. And that was the sum total of my initiation into a lifelong study.
That was a fantastic answer. And let's all take a little something away from that. Let's never let ego or fear of losing, respect points get in the way of the truth. I've asked you most of the important things I wanted to ask you, and I definitely wanted to make sure we had some time for people to ask some questions.
Oh,
If
I'm all
that's
for
right.
that, yeah.
Okay, so who wants to ask some questions? That was the first hand I saw right there. Here, I'll come over and now get you the microphone so we can actually hear who's asking the questions. Just in case any of you aren't as loudmouthed as I am.
Hi there, David. So he
Yes.
was expressing concern for when we don't have you around anymore, but my question to you is, rather than being concerned with that, what questions would you like us to start exploring to continue what you've started?
Wow. Yeah, good question. Well, part of the early phase of the research is what I called the phase of dismay, because it was motivated by a clear sense that I received from Immanuel Velikovsky, and my brother Stephen and I had developed a really close relationship with Immanuel Velikovsky, and we were publishing Immanuel Velikovsky Reconsidered, and it was starting to get attention internationally. But the phase of dismay began when I realized that Velikovsky's comet Venus can't stand alone. That Venus is in such a dynamic relationship with other ancient figures. There has to be a reason for that. For example, Venus as the central eye, heart, and soul of another figure called the primeval sun and explicitly identified as Saturn. So there's no making sense of any mythic themes. A global, archetypal theme is an anomaly. And I would challenge anyone to see if they can find a clearly stated theme of ancient myth and symbol that can be explained by something seen in our sky today. And that requires just a bit of willingness to investigate that theme, to see that the conventional explanations, which are just throwaway lines, really, they don't actually explain anything. Will any conventional explanation account for a single worldwide mythic or symbolic theme? And I don't believe so. So when you are confronted with that incredible paradox, there must be an explanation. There must be a celestial provocation for these themes. Then came the discovery that all of the themes are inseparably connected to each other. There's not a single worldwide theme of ancient myth and symbol that isn't connected to all of the other themes. And this can be enumerated through one level of ancient symbolism to another. That means the certainty. I take this as a virtual certainty that we have to basically divorce ourselves from the things we learned in school about the history of the solar system and let the ancient witnesses speak for themselves. Use the protocol of a good detective. Find the things that stand out as anomalies. Notice the connections between the anomalies. Take them seriously. Then look to the evidence and ask yourself whether any of this ancient evidence could even exist apart from that celestial provocation. So that's the logic of the inquiry.
Terrific. Next one, right here in front.
Okay, this is way out there. It's a two-part question. Do you know when nothing from the past, let me put my glasses back on. When did the sky change compared to the ancient history that you researched? And do you think maybe the Bethlehem star and the birth of Jesus was the time when it changed?
That last part would be hard to answer, but there are images from medieval times that present the Star of Bethlehem with the symmetry and the overall look of what I'd called the polar configuration. So I think there is some connection there. But with respect to dating, this is really precarious ground because there are competing chronologies of the ancient world. And I have not seen a definitive treatment of ancient chronology. So instead of trying to tie down a time frame, what I look for is the relationship of this experience to the beginnings of the civilizations. And as best I can tell, for the earliest authors of ancient texts and temple hymns and so on, it was as if it happened yesterday. The detail is so alive and it's so authentic. And as you're working back from, let's just say, the Greek times, Latin times, to the origins of the civilization, I mean, whatever that time frame might be, 2,000 years, the farther back you go, the more authentic the material is, the more authentic the original text. So I became obsessed with the Egyptian pyramid texts because these are the first complete texts from ancient Egypt, and they compete in terms of dating with the first texts, the temple hymns and so on, from ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia. Those early texts became the bedrock of the reconstruction. All I had to do was track down the literal meanings of the words, describing a great temple turning in the sky. The world mountain in explicit detail as a mountain of fire and light, a stream beneath the dwelling of the gods, rising from the earth to the center of the sky. So these images of our earliest ancestors are the most authentic and reliable pointers back to what happened and has been completely missed by the progression of science and formal studies of history in our own time.
Terrific. Over there, is that Cyril?
Yeah, James, in your research on philosophy and Wilson, and after hearing Tony's talk that you did, are you seeing a lot of evidence of cataclysms happening and leaving stars on Earth that would be mountains, like God's 3D printer printing on Earth?
I'm overwhelmed, actually, by the evidence that has been gathered by other people. It's not been my field, but every opportunity I have to encourage someone to examine the geological record from a really radical perspective on geological history, I will give that support personally to people who are driven to get to the truth of the matter and are suspicious as to textbook geology. But I personally have avoided that except for certain large-scale questions. Now, I mean, I have suggested, for example, that the planet Mars is probably for us the best case study in what occurred in our ancient sky between planets. Because in what I was working to reconstruct, the planet Mars is just inseparably tied to that image of the world mountain. This is material stretching downward toward the Earth or upward toward Mars along a world axis. Mars is the apex of the world mountain. There's no escaping certain aspects of this. And so I became conscious of a kind of geological implication. This would be, look to the circumpolar region of the Earth for evidence of vortex-type activity. But even more so, because of the role that I was seeing for the planet Mars along the axis between two other planets, Venus above Mars and Earth below, I felt there had to be a profound hemispheric dichotomy on Mars. There would just have to be, because the pictures, the picture that is given of that body in the sky involves material between Mars and Earth and between Mars and Venus that would have to have had an impact in creating a hemispheric dichotomy. So we eventually got to Mars and looked closely, sufficiently close to see that there is a profound hemispheric dichotomy on Mars. I mean, anybody can see it. Almost no craters in the northern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere is dominated almost entirely by craters. Craters next to each other, overlapping. It's just a crystal clear dichotomy. Now just ask yourself, how likely would it be that a planet evolving in isolation as the history of the solar system has been written by modern science, how likely would that body evolving in isolation exhibit that kind of spectacular dichotomy, northern and southern hemispheres? So there are issues of this sort. I was quite convinced that the Valles Marineris was the target, you might say, of the cosmic thunderbolt, as recounted most emphatically in the ancient world. The cosmic thunderbolt looks exactly like plasma electric discharge in the plasma laboratory. I learned that from the leading plasma scientist at the time I got to know him, Tony Peratt, at Los Alamos Laboratories. This image that you reconstructed, Tony said, I have seen in the laboratory. And he flew to Portland more than once to consult with us and to offer his understanding of that plasma phenomenon. And then he returned to Los Alamos and began chronicling rock art images broadly to show that they did indeed see these plasma formations in the sky, and they devoted whole lifetimes to recording those images on stone. All of this is opening up a potential and very revolutionary redefinition of solar system history. And that definition of solar system history, it resonates so beautifully with the testimony of human witnesses. So I don't think that anyone will ever be able to justify, and I've certainly heard no justification, of the idea that this modern idea that we've just lived in an uneventful solar system throughout human history. But astronomers are still entering data on planetary motions today, and they are asking their computer to retro-calculate the positions of these bodies thousands of years ago. I just can't imagine a more futile exercise than that.
If we have time for one more question, and this guy's excited.
Well, as a preface to this, as I've reviewed, as we've all looked at the electrical universe information, what's been coming out is around some of the sun bodies we're finding the orbits of Jupiter-like planets, meaning there's something going on. And then you look at the brown dwarf situation and how those things occur. And out of that comes the question for me, is we take a look at the Saturn myth and all the planetary configurations that aligned with Saturn, Venus, Mars, and then Earth. And then we find in our own historical records something coming in named Zeus or Jupiter that throws that awry. I think that's important to investigate, because as we look out and we find that these Jupiter-like things are going around, planets are going around these sun things, we have to ask the question, how did that interplay with the Saturn model that was going on? So in the historical record, my question is, since you're, in my consideration, one of the foremost world's authority on mythology, when does Zeus or Jupiter come into the picture? Was Horus a supplanter of Isis? When did that happen? And is there any strong evidence of why Zeus seemed to take over the spot, especially in Greek mythology?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you follow the ground rules of this research, the relationship between Saturn and Jupiter has to count for something. It has to have a very explicit answer, just as explicit as the other details of the reconstruction. There was a remembered celestial power identified by the Greeks as Kronos, and identified also by the Greeks as Helios before Helios was transferred. That name was transferred to our sun. This means that the ancient record, particularly around the Mediterranean, of a Jovian power associated with, in particular, the New Year's. The New Year's festival will trace back, actually, to the end of the reign of Saturn and the beginning of the reign of Jupiter. But what did that mean? This is the rebirth in the sky of Saturn himself as his child Jupiter. So if you put a particular emphasis on the New Year's festivals, this is what you'll see. The New Year's festival is celebrating the rejuvenation of the old power with the face of the reborn power, the rejuvenated power. There's probably some connection, root, I won't swear by this, but some connection to the root of Jove himself, Juvenalis. Don't quote me on that, but this is just occurring to me as I'm speaking. There is a mythic connection of Jupiter to the newborn primeval sun, the newborn universal sovereign, taking the reins of the cosmos and ruling the world as the son born of his father, Saturn. So the New Year's festival will be it will actually be a centerpiece of investigation in coming years. There are people who have actually started the research, and I'm impressed with their intensity and the sincerity of that. And I've just urged them to go to the New Year's festival, that the answers will be there.
Dave Talbott, everyone.
Thank you very much.